I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the battles raging across the east of Ukraine, report on the latest diplomatic spat between the European powers, and unpick the news of Vladimir Putin's latest weapon, the Satan II nuclear missile.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's the 21st of April, day 57. And this afternoon I'm joined by Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Theo Merz, the Telegraph's Deputy Foreign Editor, and Dearnley, Assistant Comment Editor. I started by asking for the latest news from Mariupol.
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. So Mariupol has been liberated, apparently. So in a rather bizarre televised performance released this morning, Putin was shown with his Defence Minister General Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu was reporting back to his boss saying Mariupol's liberated, virtually done, and he was talking about all sorts of weapons and tanks being moved about. And then in his munificence, Putin says, no, it's liberated. There's no point in pushing into the catacombs, and we need to preserve the lives and health of our soldiers and officers, and has basically halted the attack. I mean, it's excruciating to watch. It's just so stage managed. It's very interesting to watch. I think the messaging that comes out of it, which we'll speak about in a moment, I'm sure it says more than is actually on view. But we'll come back to it in a moment. I know Theo will have some views.
Yeah, it's difficult to tell from the video that we've seen from the Kremlin today about what is actually happening on the ground, because as Dom has said, there's Putin is saying and Shoigu are saying that the city has been liberated, but also Putin saying we're not going to storm the last places where Ukrainian forces are holding out and where they have been holding out for several weeks. And we and all other media have written a lot about the last stand of Mariupol, and it could be days, it could be hours until it falls, and that hasn't happened because there's been such fierce resistance there from the Azov battalion and other Ukrainian troops. So it's hard to tell what has really changed. And it seems like what is coming out today may be more intended for a domestic audience in Russia, or is likely more intended for a domestic audience, that they're able to see Putin the peacemaker and Putin a reasonable leader who is saying, okay, we've achieved our, well, he's saying that he's got a win. He's saying that it's liberated. We've achieved our objectives, but also we're not going to have excessive bloodshed here. And that's probably the image he wants to project more than a hawkish attacker of Ukraine. Well, it certainly is the image he wants to project more than that. He's framed this whole conflict as defending Ukrainians and purging them from Nazi elements. But in terms of what that means in the city of Mariupol, we don't really know.
Dom, do you want to expand on any of that?
Yeah, I think it's a recognition from Russia that they're just, well, two things, that the juice ain't worth the squeeze. They're just going to lose too many fighters and too much equipment trying to squeeze that last pocket out of Mariupol, which is tactically irrelevant. I mean, it's strategically an information, in terms of the information campaign, important. But in terms of Russia having a land corridor from Crimea to through the Donbass and up to the Russian border, I mean, that the last little bit of the steel factory, I mean, it is tactically irrelevant. So why they've been pressing it so hard for the last 2 weeks is about the symbolism. And we know Putin likes the symbolism. We've talked about May the 9th before, and Mariupol was symbolic. But I think what he's done here is said that for the 8 or 9 battalion tactical groups that Western officials say are being soaked up there, I mean, he needs them in the Donbass. It needs them to go north, and they're not going to be in any position to any shape or position to do that anytime soon. But it speaks again of the May the 9th date and this desperation for a victory. I think it's very interesting that he's coached it in these terms. Alexei Navalny's chief of staff, Alexei Navalny, the prominent Russian opposition activist, he was saying that Putin doesn't do anything with such stage management, or anything at all, without really being clear about the message he wants to send out, and it's mainly for domestic opinion. And so he's saying here, in his munificence, he's sort of calling this the operation a success, and everyone fighting as a hero on the Russian side. Get the medals ready, lads, and let's all take a break and head off somewhere else. I mean, you should go and watch it. I don't know if we've got the film actually up on the Telegraph website yet. I hope we do later, but have a look around. You'll find it everywhere else. Sorry about that. But do go and have a look at it. It's just over a minute long. And I mean, Putin starts going on about, well, we must ensure that, or you must ensure that all the wounded are treated correctly in accordance, and he uses this phrase, in accordance with international legal rights. I mean, he's preparing his defence for the ICC in plain view. It's just absolutely extraordinary. But I mean, as much as symbolism matters to him, it will also matter to the Ukrainians. And I mean, this has been a stout defence by them. I mean, incredible defence. And it was going to go down in folklore along with the Russian warship, et cetera, et cetera. And now they're going to live. I think it's just extraordinary. Russia's shown itself not too concerned about dropping heavy ordnance on civilian areas. So saying that he's doing this to spare the civilians that are also in the factory, I think is a bit rubbish. I just think it was too hard a nut to crack, and he realised he's got to get on. He needs something soon, and I think it does give more credence that the May the 9th date is very, very important to him. But it is a very bizarre state of affairs, and yes, we'll be writing about it later on today. But the language between Putin and Shoigu ordering this halt, it's clearly for another audience, mainly domestic, but I think also, as I said, mainly partly also for the international sort of legal community. But I urge everyone to go and have a look at the video.
I would just echo that this is now become, not rather ironically, given that we were talking about it yesterday, a symbolic battle more than a military one. We were speaking about the Battle of Stalingrad and how the last stand in that battle by the German forces when surrounded by the Soviets was in a tractor factory. And so obviously we are, as I say, seeing a parallel here, given that this is in a steel factory. I'm wondering as well whether perhaps Vladimir Putin has realised that as we know, he's very conscious of his historical parallels, and whether he is rather concerned about them holding out for longer than anticipated, and so has made the manoeuvre of effectively invalidating the significance of Mariupol being won round 100%, and to just declare it prematurely, knowing that if it becomes if he were to make a big propaganda deal about defeating this last stand, that he may well be dragged into a much more prolonged delay than he would like in taking Mariupol. And we'll come later on into the other areas in which I think that many of his pronouncements in the last 24 hours are for a domestic audience, not least on the nuclear declarations yesterday, which I think we'll cover in depth. But as just to echo what Dom and Theo were saying, this is really not about military anymore. This is now symbolic, and the danger is that when the politicians see symbols often as being far more significant than military, and that goes back from the Second World War to Napoleon in Moscow, and often it has severe ramifications. And perhaps we're seeing that Putin is trying to learn from that, but I wouldn't bank on it.
Thank you very much, Francis. What else is going on away from Mariupol across the Donbass? What else should we be aware of in the last 24 hours, Theo and Dom?
So there's been a lot of shelling around Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk, you'll remember, is the town on the edge of the Donbass. It was subject to that horrific attack on the 8th of April with all a number of civilians, or thousands, it was expected, or estimated thousands of civilians trying to get out of the town, trying to get on trains to head west. And the ballistic missile strike killed, at the moment, 59, hundreds wounded. Appalling attack on the 8th of April. But that town is going under more rocket attacks at the moment, and there are reports of Russian troops advancing from staging areas to the east of that town. So again, as we've seen, this Donbass phase gaining a little bit of momentum. We're still not there yet. These are small gains led by very heavily by artillery and air rocket missile fire, which is straight out of the textbook of the Russian textbook about how to do this stuff. So we've yet to see any proper combined arms maneuver. So infantry, tanks working in concert with engineers and artillery and all the rest of it, all the different parts being brought to bear. It's still kind of just grinding down with artillery, then moving into the rubble afterwards. But that's happening around Kramatorsk. And I've got some interesting stuff from Mykolaiv, which I'll just pause there in case Theo wants to add anything else. But also Mykolaiv coming under pressure in a moment.
I think the other thing of note this morning, or the other thing from the Ukrainian side this morning, is Ukraine saying that if possible, it will strike the Crimean bridge, which is a Russian-built bridge. It cost them about $3.7 billion. And it's the longest bridge in Europe, big strategic significance in that it links the south of Russia to Crimea and allows them to bring equipment and troops into Ukraine from Russia to use in this offensive. And also it's a massive project of Putin. He opened it personally 4 years ago, I think, and it was one of the national security advisors of Ukraine was asking allies for weapons to strike it, saying it would solve a lot of their problems if that could happen. Not saying that there's any movement on that at the moment, but it's obviously a notable thing that they're saying this. The Kremlin has responded, as you might expect, very badly to it, accusing Ukraine of calling for terrorist acts. So that may be something to look for in the weeks to come.
Thank you, Theo. Dom, you said you had some thoughts on what's happening in Mykolaiv.
Yeah, so I've been chatting over social media with David Patrikarakos, who's a journalist out there at the moment, and he's had a fascinating interview with the mayor. So Mykolaiv, in the south, on the route to Odessa, under extreme pressure, but not occupied at the moment by Russian forces. They're very close by on the eastern side. Tried to envelop or at least go around Mykolaiv to get towards Odessa, and was repulsed. That was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that seems to be where the edge of the Russian expansion to the northwest of Crimea has got. So Mykolaiv is just to the north of Kherson, the town that is the first city that was taken by Russia and is now in very disputed territory. So Mykolaiv has been under a lot of shelling for weeks now. There are water shortages. So David has put out a long Twitter thread. I urge you to read, talking about the water shortages there and how the population having to get their supplies from tankers. But he interviewed the mayor. And the mayor was a fairly bullish character, as you'd imagine. And he said he moves constantly. He doesn't sleep in the same place for 2 nights in a row. And then said, all I need is my gun and a place to wash. The mayor says he's been getting messages from Russia since the start of the war. These messages saying surrender or face the fate of Mariupol. And the mayor said, I told them either go home and live or come here and die. Welcome to hell, melon farmers. And for those of you that know your cinema, melon farmers is not the word that the mayor used, but the word that Hollywood used to dub over various stages of various movies. And the mayor says that the Russian forces are unmotivated. They're fighting for a cause they don't either understand or don't believe in. And he said the Ukrainians are over-motivated. So very, very, very bullish defence there from the mayor of Mykolaiv. And there's more of that, more information from him in his interview with David Patrikarakos, which you can find on Twitter. But yeah, so Mykolaiv has been bearing the brunt for weeks now, as of many other cities. But it's helped push back that advance west to Odessa and north to Dnipro, and they've absolutely been taking a pounding. But doesn't sound like the defence there is wavering at all.
Last night, Vladimir Putin boasted that he had unleashed the first successful test of a new nuclear missile known as the Satan II, carrying a dozen warheads. Can we talk a little bit about what this missile is, how it works? And as always with these questions about Russia, what does this show us about the strength of the Russian position?
Yes, well, it's ironic that we were talking about yesterday that as the situation gets likely more desperate for the Russian forces, that we can expect another proclamation from Vladimir Putin about the use of nuclear warheads against NATO. And so it has proved that within a matter of hours that he's done exactly that. So as you say, this is the first successful test of a new nuclear missile known rather charmingly as Satan II, which carries a dozen warheads that could be used to strike multiple targets around the world. It's a 200-ton intercontinental ballistic missile, and he describes it as, quote, a present to NATO, that would make the Moscow's enemies think twice. Obviously, it comes at a significant moment strategically in the war in Ukraine. And he claims, Putin, that it's capable of overcoming all of the modern means of anti-missile defense, and that it's a unique weapon that will strengthen the combat, and I'm quoting here, strengthen the combat potential of our armed forces, reliably ensuring Russia's security from external threats and providing food for thought for those who, in the heat of frenzied aggressive rhetoric, try to threaten our country. Just to give a sense of what this, supposedly this weapon would be capable of doing, it can travel around 11,000 miles from where it's fired, and from Russia's extreme western border, you could expect that it would be able to hit a city like London in about 13 minutes. So it is yet to be deployed. The intention is that it would be deployed at the end of the year, so it's not like he's announced that this is actually a weapon that can be utilised. But what is the significance of this? Well, ultimately, as we were just talking about, this has been designed, this announcement, I think, for a domestic audience at home, and also obviously to concern the Western powers about the amount of military support that they provide to the Ukrainian forces. But as we've talked about, this May the 9th deadline, which is getting close, and Putin needs to build up this idea that the war is going well back at home before this big parade in Moscow on the 9th. And so I think that we shouldn't read perhaps as much into it as perhaps we might be tempted to, as we were in the early stages of the war. I think it is not a threat tomorrow, as it were, although of course that would change if he were to use the already conventional nuclear weapons in Russia on some sort of targeted strike on Kiev, as we spoke about yesterday. But I think that the curious parallel, I spoke about a parallel earlier on with World War II, and I think that it just struck me this, that he's developing this new nuclear missile, and which is largely for, I suppose, a domestic audience, and also to try and enhance the strategic position of Russia long term. And it was exactly this thinking that took hold, I suppose, of the Nazi hierarchy at the end of the Second World War in 1944 and 1945. As the war took a dark turn, Hitler became absolutely convinced that the way to win the war would be to spend millions of marks on funding German science and modern warfare capabilities, and genuinely believed that sort of this fantastic weaponry could reverse the war in one stroke, and that the key to any future success in military engagements was going to be these new futuristic weapons. And the result of this was a complete technical disaster. It was a shortage of resources. It was constant political interference when more focused on conventional warfare should have been the priority. Obviously, you're faced with the inherent difficulty of accelerating research work at the forefront of science, whilst you've got resources that are limited and everything else. So with the Allies, in contrast, stuck with the conventional weapons of the late 1930s, but with the exception of the Manhattan Project, and that obviously proved to be a far more sounder strategy. So you can see from what I'm saying here is that there are several echoes and parallels, I think, with what we're seeing in Ukraine. That as the situation is getting more desperate, as conventional warfare seems to be failing, that suddenly Putin is looking to more advanced forms of warfare that could sort of show NATO who's boss, if I can articulate it in that way. But it's a very, very dangerous path, and a similar mistake to one strategically that Hitler made in the 1940s. And I think perhaps the way of just thinking about this, and I'm quoting here from Richard Overy, who wrote a fantastic book which I recommend to people about why the Allies won, and it dispels many myths about why World War II went the way that it did. He says, "In the end, the Soviet army proved just modern enough, but the German forces were far too modern for their own good." And what he means by that is that this focus on trying to be modern, trying to be cutting edge, ultimately undermined the German military efforts. And I think that we may well be seeing same with Russia here. And of course, it's a mistake that they also made in the Cold War, trying to develop the most advanced forms of nuclear warfare, bankrupting the economy, and ultimately it leading to a complete implosion in 1989 and beyond.
Thanks, Francis. Theo and Dom, wondering what you have to add to that.
I think the only thing to add is that we note this and move on. I think Francis's points that he made there are the areas we should focus on. That this is, I think, mainly for domestic consumption in Russia to sort of shore up or divert attention from a poor performance in Ukraine. I mean, it's the new car on the driveway when you look out the window. So yeah, it's bigger, it's faster, it goes further, it's got more bombs on board. But let's talk numbers for a moment. So the Sarmat missile itself, that's just the truck, right? That just carries the nuclear missiles. Now inside it can supposedly carry some of these hypersonic glide vehicles. But in terms of nuclear bombs itself, nuclear weapons, they say, I mean, the numbers are sketchy. Russia don't really put out many numbers, but it's thought that there's any number between sort of 10 big nuclear missiles and 15 small. I don't think there's much of a distinction between big and small when you're talking about nuclear weapons. But anyway, so let's take the 10, which are the biggest. These are they're called Merz, which is multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. So they are individual nuclear weapons in their own right. They don't just fall ballistically; they can be targeted to different locations. So the 10 MIRVs that could be carried by this thing each have the explosive power of 750 kilotons. Now, for comparison, Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. So these are massive weapons, huge explosions. Very devastating, absolutely horrific. Hopefully, you never get used. Now, the current British nuclear deterrent, we have 4 nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines, one of which is always on patrol. For the last 53 years, there's been a nuclear-armed submarine somewhere around the world at every moment of every day. For the last 53 years, ready to launch Britain's nuclear deterrent should the order be given. Now, those boats, and I've been on one of them, they have 16 launch tubes. At the moment, we're told that they don't go to sea with them all full. We're told, through very cagey tones, we expect about 8 of the tubes have got a missile in at any one time. But each of those missiles, as I say, that's just the truck. Each of those missiles, the British missiles, have 8 MIRVs, 8 of these multiple independent re-entry vehicles in. And the British MIRVs are each thought to be about, again, numbers are sketchy. The Ministry of Defence and the government never talk about nuclear stuff. But each of the British MIRVs are thought to be about 100 kilotons. As I said, Hiroshima was about 15. So 100 kilotons is itself a horrific number to consider. The range is about nearly 5,000 miles, and the Sarmat has a range of about 11,000 miles. So this the new missile that Russia unveiled yesterday can go further, and it's got each of the MIRVs have a lot more destructive power. But I mean that doesn't mean that everything else is suddenly rendered useless. There's still broadly comparable numbers between the US and Russia in terms of their destructive power. France, Britain, and China are much lower. So we have about anywhere between 180 and 220 weapons available. thought to be similar for France, maybe slightly more for China. We're not entirely sure. But I mean, these are horrific weapons. They're massively powerful. So it's largely, we don't need to get too wrapped up on the top trumps about all this. And yes, this new thing that Russia showed off yesterday is, as I say, it's a new car out on the forecourt. But I mean, Britain at the moment, we're upgrading the submarines. So the Dreadnought program is going to introduce 4 new nuclear armed subs in the 2030s. We've already committed to buying a new missile. The missile we use, the Trident II D5 missile, which is an American missile. We're upgrading that. The warhead, which is British made, we're upgrading that. So I mean, this is what armies do. Militaries, you regularly update your stocks, and of course, the new thing is going to be bigger, shinier, look a lot better, have a nice badge, and all the rest of it, much more than the one you're getting rid of. So, we don't need to worry about this the Sarmat missile from Russia in terms of, oh my goodness, we've never seen anything like this before. Yes, we have. We've been living with it for decades now. They are horrendous, and we hope never to entertain their employment. The numbers have gone up. But like I say, that's not what's the bit we need to focus on here. The bit we need to focus on here is, why was it unveiled yesterday, and all this chatter about hitting NATO, and of course the compliant Kremlin media have gone doolally about this and said it's all wonderful and we should launch them immediately, and so on and so forth. I think the point to note is, as Francis said, this is a bit like the Nazi super weapons of the Second World War. This is a diversionary tactic and one to deflect opinion from a fairly poor performance in Ukraine.
Thanks, Dom. Theo and Francis, any comments on that before we move on?
Just one last one from me, which is just very aware, as Dom was saying, and speaking about these weapons, and we're very right to do so because this is vitally important, but it just speaks to another huge and tragic consequence of this war, that we have effectively returned to the Cold War. Comparing the sizes of these heinous weapons is just something that we thought we had moved on from, I think. And yet here we are, that due to the saber rattling of Vladimir Putin and his illegal invasion of Ukraine, we have returned to a different way of thinking about warfare, and it just feels archaic to me. And I think it's just, as I say, a point that's worth making, that he has opened the floodgates for a way of thinking about weapons that I think many people, many historians have thought that we'd perhaps close the door on for the betterment of humanity.
Thank you, Francis. Let's talk a little bit more about Germany. We spoke about... Oh, sorry, Theo, did you want to come in on that? I just saw you unmuted. Please do.
Oh, no, well, I was just going to say that already Biden in the States is getting some criticism for lack of funding or cuts to America's nuclear program, which I think does just speak into this Cold War stockpiling mentality. Whether those criticisms are legitimate or not, this idea that is around that because Russia has unveiled this new weapon, then the US should do the same or should be matching it in some way. So that criticism certainly speaks to what Francis has been talking about.
Thank you very much, Theo. Let's talk a little bit about Germany. We spoke about Germany yesterday, and if you listen to this podcast regularly or listen on Twitter yesterday, you'll know that. Germany has sort of hit back a little bit at some of the accusations it's not doing enough to help Ukraine. Theo and Francis, can you talk us through what's been happening and what people have been saying?
Yeah, well, Olaf Scholz has come under the German Chancellor has come under pressure domestically and internationally to do more to help Ukraine, to send heavy weapons in the same way that the US and the UK and others have been doing. And he gave a press conference a couple of days ago, I think, just as the UK and US were announcing new heavy weaponry that was very, very cautious and saying that, well, we're not going to send anything directly, but Ukraine can buy from us if they want, and we've alerted the German military to that. And it was all very cautious and coded. And the army the German army have backed him up on this. But there's been a lot from opposition politicians in Germany and even members of his own coalition saying that we really must do more. And now Germany is pointing to the UK and saying, well, the UK isn't sending these particular type of weapons or this particular type of hardware, and why aren't they getting the criticism that we are getting. And I think it all speaks to a long-running perception or reality of Germany's role since this conflict has begun, or even before it began, that it wasn't doing as much practically to help Ukraine because it is so reliant on Russian energy and traditionally has these quite relatively close ties to Russia and not wanting to upset the Kremlin because of these business links, or not wanting to upset the Kremlin in the way that some other countries will do. And I think that culminated last week when Zelensky said that the German president wasn't welcome to visit Kiev at the same time that a lot of other European leaders and Boris Johnson were doing so because of their stance on the conflict.
Thanks, Theo. I don't know if Francis or Dom want to come in on especially the criticism that they're not sending these weapons. Is that fair, or is it more that allies are sort of sending what they can send?
Well, there's some contradictory things coming out from Germany and from other sources as to whether they are able to send these tanks, whether they would be able to be fitted in time, and whether they actually would want to give them away anyway in case there were some sort of escalation of the war. But my point would just be to reiterate some of those we were making yesterday on Germany. I know we had an extended segment on Germany yesterday, which is, it seems to me that Germany are, in a sense, stuck because of their reliance on Russian oil and gas, and because, to Theo's point about the diplomatic closer ties forged during the Merkel era with Russia. But ultimately, they need to wake up, I think, to the new reality that every day that Germany is sending the vast amount, and of course they're not the only country that are guilty of this, as we've spoken about in the past, but every day that they are sending the amount of money that they are sending to Ukraine, to Russia, is funding the atrocities that are taking place on Europe's doorstep, and of course on Germany's doorstep. And this sort of hand-wringing middle way that it seems that Scholz is trying to maneuver, I think will be very harshly judged by history. Ultimately, one is facing existential threats like this, you have to come down on one side or another, according to the judgment of history. Look at Churchill in 1940. Look at Zelensky, one could argue, in the opening days of this conflict. And if you make the wrong call, you will go down in history as having made that, just as Chamberlain has done, rightly or wrongly. And I think that they seriously need to consider their policy, and I think there is evidence that is taking place within Germany. There's been a lot of criticism of Scholz, not only from journalists there, but also from other politicians. But it just seems to me that they have, through a ill-conceived foreign policy built over many years, that they are essentially in a very, very difficult situation, and one that no country, and this is a warning to all of countries around the world, that no country really wants to be in, which is that you are so reliant on effectively a hostile power that one's ability to adapt and survive is severely hampered. And so I think there's a warning to all of us there.
Thanks, Francis. Dom, I know you want to come in on this.
Yeah, I'll just add that when this sort of broke yesterday, this spat about the German Marder infantry fighting vehicle, it kind of did the rounds. I rang the German defence attaché here in London, so Brigadier General Michael Obermeier, just to have a chat with him. And I mean, he wasn't massively defensive. I don't think he felt particularly bruised by it. He was a bit more bewildered, really. I mean, there are very good reasons why you should give all the kit you can to Ukraine if you want to help them in this war. And there are also many reasons why it's just not practical. And he was echoing the line from Berlin about why it's not practical for these to send a load of Marder infantry fighting vehicles. Said Germany has upgraded to a vehicle called Puma. So Marder is going out of service, but they still use them and they still need them and they still train on them. And they're quite old now, so they use a lot of the fleet. They cannibalize a lot of the fleet to keep the ones going in the training fleet that they do need. So he was feeling like I say, he wasn't bruised, he wasn't defensive at all. He was just sort of explaining explaining the realities. But he did make the very good point. He said, "Well, what about the British Army's Warrior? I mean, we just cancelled the Warrior upgrade program, capability sustainment program. We're going over to Boxer and Ajax. So there's hundreds of Warrior infantry fighting vehicles that are currently in Luggershall, covered in grease, waiting for the day to come out and fight." He said, "Well, why hasn't Britain offered those?" Which is a fair point. And I wasn't there to defend the MOD, but I didn't have an answer to that. He said, "What about the French? The French AMX vehicles? There's other vehicles there around the bazaars, around NATO and other countries that are available." I mean, it'd be very interesting to hear from somebody from the British MOD or someone from the French diplomatic corps, perhaps, who might want to opine on this. But yeah, I mean, we can all point the finger, and Germany is in a testing position. I do accept Francis's point that Scholz probably needs to make a call one way or the other on the military side. But yeah, it's not. We shouldn't just draw all this down and focus on, as we did a few weeks ago, 29 MiGs from Poland and now 25 Marder vehicles from Germany. There's a lot of tunes to play on all of this. But it was just interesting to chat to General Obermeyer yesterday, and got a few of his comments in an article in today's Telegraph.
Just one final thought on that. I've had a direct message a moment ago from a listener who's made the point that Germany actually provided tanks to Turkey in their sort of genocide against the Kurds. So not necessarily the best previous experience of deploying tanks, but it just shows that in the past they have been very willing to. I need to do some more reading about this, but it does need to do some more. That there has been evidence in the past of them giving tanks to foreign nations, and it seems a shame that they're not capable of doing so now.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you, Dom, and thank you, Theo. One more thing to talk about, I think, before we wrap up is that it is 3 years since Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine. Theo, you put these notes in. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, what an anniversary for him.
Yeah, I saw this on social media that it had been 3 years, and I sort of recoiled from the screen because I couldn't believe how much has changed in that time. I was in Ukraine for those elections 3 years ago, and at the time, it really seemed there was a lot of people who voted for him as a sort of none of the above candidate, that they were so sick of the traditional Ukrainian parties that they saw as corrupt or problematic in different ways, that they would literally elect a comedian who played the president in a TV series to be president. And a lot of people that I spoke to there really sort of despaired at that idea and thought, is this really what we've come to? And we're such a joke, and it's a joke that we've elected this man. And how much has changed since then, that he's such a celebrated international figure now, and also he's so supported in Ukraine because of the way that he has led the resistance and led the response to this war. And a lot of people there now are saying that they couldn't have imagined having one of those people from the traditional parties in charge. So it has no significance on the ground and no real significance in the war. But I just thought that was an anniversary worth noting, how this global statesman, I suppose, has been formed in such a short amount of time. And we and others have written about how in some ways his TV background has aided that. Not only is he an actor who can perform these roles, obviously not saying that he's performing he's pretending in any way the role that he's doing now, but he is able to get his message across in a very polished way. And also a lot of his team is from the world of television and are able to use comms really expertly and in a much more accessible and possibly effective way than the Kremlin does, which also, of course, has a massive PR operation of its own.
Thank you, Theo. Francis and Dom, any comments on that before I'll ask you for your final thoughts?
Well, I don't wish to be crass about this at all, but somebody put it to me, and I thought it was such a interesting way of articulating it that it stuck with me, which is somebody said that, from the equivalent of Zelensky being going down in history in the way that he has from his background, it would be the equivalent of many people listening will be familiar with the film Love Actually, and Hugh Grant playing the British Prime Minister in that as a not exactly a fool, but not certainly not a Churchillian figure, and it would be the equivalent of the actor Hugh Grant being elected Prime Minister and then going down in history as our next Churchill. I mean, it is an extraordinary story. You literally couldn't make it up. And but I completely echo what Theo was saying, is that I think that sort of fate has been very kind in that it has given Ukraine a figure able to use modern forms of technology, whether it be TV, social media, incredibly effectively in a way that has mobilized the world to the Ukrainian cause that would not have been possible even 10 years ago. And so it is a remarkable story, and one that I think will have many lessons to leaders around the world. And let's just hope that this war will end, and that Zelensky will be able to be on the world stage for a long time, because I think we need figures like him that can articulate the value and the meaning of freedom to millions, billions.
Thank you, Francis. So I think we've come to the end of our time here. So can I just ask all of our guests for their thoughts on the days ahead? What should our listeners be looking for in the next stage of this war?
Well, I'm sorry I'm sounding a bit repetitive, but as I said yesterday, and probably the day before that, it's just the Donbass yet to see any evidence that Russia has learnt lessons and able to conduct really good combined arms maneuver warfare there, integrating all the various parts of the military. So still just grinding its way up Route 1 with led by artillery, and then going and sticking a flag on the rubble afterwards. So that's what I'm keeping an eye on.
I think what we'll be keeping an eye on is what actually happens in Mariupol now, because even though Putin has said that it's liberated and they're not going to storm the final holdouts of resistance, that of course doesn't necessarily mean that they won't storm the final holdouts of resistance. So I think still a lot of attention there, even if the Kremlin are trying to present this as a closed case.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.